Hello, I'm Ciarán Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Getting the feeding regime right in late pregnancy has a big impact on successful lambing and overall flock performance. We discuss various aspects of this with Michael Gottstein, the head of sheep in Teagasc. Michael starts off by discussing the importance of using scan results, the expected lambing date where available, to determine the amount of supplementation required, as well as how to manage thin ewes during late pregnancy. Michael also offers advice for farms out there with low feed value silage. We discuss the pros and cons of pelleted versus coarse rations, how to introduce supplementation, and ultimately how to minimise the risk of acidosis, particularly in the latter stages of pregnancy where feed levels are high. We move on to discuss the type of ingredients you would like to see in a ration for late pregnancy feeding. And delving into this in a bit more detail, he outlines the key energy requirements, the importance of the correct protein source, and the mineral requirements for this ration. We start off, however, with Michael highlighting again the importance of using forage analysis as the base of developing the late pregnancy feeding regime.
Yeah, Ciarán, look at it. I think it's really important to kind of have an idea as to how good your forage is. Your forage is a big part of the ewes diet in mid-pregnancy and even into late pregnancy, really, until we start cranking up the meal for the twins and the triplets, at which stage then the silage becomes less important. So knowing how good the silage is really will let you ration properly. It'll let you basically formulate a diet that makes sure that your lambs won't be too small at birth, they won't be too big at birth, and that your ewes lamb down in good body condition and with plenty of milk. And really, I suppose, look at it, as important as it is knowing what your silage or hay quality is, it's also important to have your scan and your ewes divided according to their scan, but also according to body condition. So, and when we're talking about scanning ewes, really in trying to have your singles separate from your twins and your triplets, but also it's important to remember that if you have thin single-bearing ewes, they should be really fed with the twins, and if you have thin twin-bearing ewes, they should really be in with the triplets, getting a little bit of extra meal to try and build them up in late pregnancy. So that's important, really, that we have that kind of a plan. We know how good our forage is, and then that we batch the sheep according to litter size, body condition score, and if you can, lambing date as well, so that you have the later lambing twins in with the singles, the later lambing triplets in with the twins, and maybe the later lambing singles in with sheep that are getting no meal, your dry ewes or your hogget ewes that aren't in lamb.
So look at the consequence of that is that you're going to have sufficient sized lambs, but you're not going to have oversized ones either in that batch.
That's the important thing, I suppose, and it also saves money in terms of you're not feeding meal that you don't need to be feeding, and very often we see a ewe there that lambs maybe 5 weeks after the start of lambing. If she starts getting meal the same day as the first batch of ewes that are lambing 5 weeks earlier, she'll have eaten 5 weeks of extra meal by the time she lambs, and that often results in a ewe that's over fat, a lamb that's very, very big, maybe with lambing difficulty, and also a lot of money spent on her in terms of meal that she didn't really need as such.
And it also probably coincides with time where maybe the attention to detail at lambing is at the end of 5 weeks is not just the same for one that might need assistance. So certainly, look, it's not ideal, but put you back on an earlier point there, Michael. Like we're at a time now where a lot of flocks will need to start supplementing, particularly maybe triplets or any quads in the flock. But also for flocks maybe that haven't got good quality silage, or where ewes are a little bit behind the target condition going into the ram, they haven't pulled up at this stage. They need to get in early with feed in them scenarios, as opposed to trying to cram in a lot in the last 4, 5, 6 weeks. Maybe you'll just take us through that a bit.
Yeah, so it's very important we say that we don't lose a lot of body condition, because it's very hard to put body condition back on the ewes in late pregnancy. So going in time is really, really important. So if you have silage that is kind of 60, 65 DMD, that's pretty ropey stuff. Ewes are probably going to start losing body condition on that as they start approaching, kind of 8 weeks out from lambing triplets, probably even a little bit before it. And going in with a small bit of meal to those at that stage will keep them up. And it'll prevent that body condition loss. And it's not that you're feeding an awful lot more meal, you're just feeding the meal over a longer period of time, spreading it out, rather than cramming in meal in the last 5 or 6 weeks, trying to make up for ewes that are thin And at that stage, no matter how much you feed the ewes, it's very hard to put body condition on ewes in late pregnancy. They tend to apportion an awful lot of the feed that you give them to the lambs. So, feeding thin ewes, a lot of meal in late pregnancy in the last 4, 5 or 6 weeks, because you haven't started on time, results in big lambs and thin ewes. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We don't want really, really big lambs, and we certainly don't want thin ewes at lambing time, because, there is work done there that shows that ewes that lose a lot of body condition have a higher risk of losing their lambs, of lamb mortality, because they're not able to cope with feeding the lambs when conditions get tough later on. They don't have the body condition to fall back on. So I suppose the message really here is Ciarán, is find out how good your silage is. Go in time. If you have poor quality silage, start feeding a little bit earlier. For a lot of people, feeding triplets should really be happening shortly after you scan them. And then it's basically down to looking at the type of ration that you're feeding them, the quality of it, and the ingredients.
And that's something, we'll tease out a bit more in a moment. But you mentioned something there very relevant, Michael. In them scenarios, I know we always try to keep costs down on farms, but it's a good investment to go in with a small amount. We're only talking maybe 300 grams or so, 400 grams a day in an early stage. It's not huge quantities. It's really the last couple of weeks where huge quantities go in when you start feeding up to about 1 kilo.
Yeah, so if you go in 2 weeks earlier and you start feeding at 200 grams a day or 300 grams a day, you're feeding somewhere in between 1.5 and 2 kilos of concentrates per ewe. So we're talking about probably somewhere around 40 to 60 cent, maybe 65 cent, depending on the cost of the concentrate per ewe. It's a relatively small cost. That's per week that you're putting in there. So it's not that you're spending a lot of money. What you're doing is you're investing in the body condition of the ewe and the success of your enterprise going forward. It's taking that decision early, and making the decision going in with a bit of feed.
Look, it might be for all flocks, but certainly, we always talk about managing condition is important. Look, just a generic one, Michael, always crops up. It's a stage here where a lot of purchasing in rations. Looking at a nut or a pelleted ration versus blends, maybe you just take us through maybe briefly the pros and cons of each option.
Yep. So for most people, it's if you're buying it from a miller, you're either buying a nut, or you're buying it in coarse form. And look at again, always we would recommend that when you're buying a ration from a miller, that you get it with a mineral added, and a bit of molasses in there to hold the mineral is very, very important. That it's a properly balanced ration. Now, I suppose the pros and cons of it, from a purely nutritional point of view, I suppose the coarse ration is probably preferential insofar as that we can include a lot of whole grain in the diet of ewes, in particular if you're feeding high levels. So somebody who has poor quality silage or a very high level of triplet and quad bearing ewes, where you might be feeding 1 or 1.2 kilograms of concentrate per head per day in late pregnancy in the last 2 or 3 weeks, having a coarse ration with some or all of the grain going in there in whole format is beneficial from an acidosis and a rumen point of view, because it's much more slowly digested. It causes less stomach upsets. I suppose that's the positive side on the coarse ration. The downside, I suppose, on the coarse ration is that it separates out in storage and in transport, so it needs to be very well mixed, in particular if there's a mineral there that doesn't settle out. It also allows the sheep to sort ingredients. If there is unpalatable ingredients in it, they can sort those out and refuse them, leave them in the trucks. That's not so much a problem with ewes. Tends to be more of a problem with store lambs that are being fed ad lib, or young lambs that are in creep feeders that are being fed ad lib. They'll leave a particular ingredient after them, and eventually the truck will fill up and they'll end up chucking it out on the ground. So that's wasteful. And the third, and I suppose one of the very common complaints or comments that we get from farmers regarding coarse rations is the birds. Coarse ration seems to attract an awful lot more birds, crows and pigeons into the shed. sifting through the silage, looking for the bits that the sheep haven't picked up, as opposed to cubed rations or nuts, where the sheep basically eat virtually everything and there's very little left for the crows to come into the shed for. So I suppose that's the real benefit, nut versus coarse. The nut, of course, is, each nut is uniform, it's mixed and pelleted, and the mineral is and all the ingredients are bound inside the nut. It's very easy to transport. It doesn't settle out in transport. It's easier to feed, I suppose. It's more dense, so you fit more of it into a bucket. If you're feeding in buckets or drums, the sheep it's easier for them to pick it up, and they can't sort out the ingredients. They can't sort out it, and you have less problems with crows. So I suppose the downside of the nut is that all the ingredients are very finely ground in a nut. They're milled and very finely ground, and then put through the dye, which presses them into the nut form. And that means when they go into the sheep's stomach, they dissolve, and all those very, very finely ground ingredients are available and broken down for the bacteria to start digesting, and you tend to get a much more rapid reduction in rumen pH if you're feeding nuts than if you're feeding coarse rations. So a little bit more care needs to be taken in feeding it to avoid acidosis or digestive upsets in the ewes, especially when we're feeding high levels.
Just speaking of that, I know we've alluded to aspects of it before, but the risk of acidosis or subclinical acidosis has a knock-on on performance, the health, well-being of an animal, and in very bad cases could be fatal. But Michael, trying to avoid acidosis in sheep, and the amount that we go in and feed each time, the guidelines are probably there for a reason, but you might just take us through the implications of getting it wrong.
Yeah, so the implications of getting it wrong are pretty stark. Usually when we get it wrong, it's in late pregnancy, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, when we're feeding very high levels. That's the stage where your ewes are very dependent on the concentrate. And, something like a subacute acidosis or a bout of acidosis can trigger things like twin lamb disease or milk fever. Ewes go down, need intervention. You may lose some of them, and that's what we really want to avoid. So really, it's easy to avoid acidosis in sheep, and it just takes a few simple management steps that we need to mind. The first one is that we introduce the feed gradually, and so you start 5-6 weeks out and you build them up slowly, going up kind of 0.2 of a kilogram per week max, if you're increasing in 0.2 increments, 0.2 kilograms per day increments. So for the first week, we feed 200 grams a day every day for the 7 days. Then we go to 400 grams a day. The second and very, very important point, which a lot of farmers aren't doing, is you need to split the feed once you get to 500 grams a day into 2 equal feeds. And very often we see people who are feeding 700 or 800 grams a day in a single feed, and while they may be getting away with it for a period of time, eventually it catches up with most people and they get a belt of subacute acidosis or acidosis, and it has a big impact on performance. So once you start feeding your ewes over half a kilogram per head per day, you need to switch to twice daily feeding, morning and evening, at least 8 hours between feeds. And that's basically just to allow the rumen pH to come back up and start digesting fiber, for fiber to be digested before you go in with the next belt of meal that's going to give them starch and drop the rumen pH again. And very important here as well is trough space. If the ewes haven't got trough space, the stronger, greedier, bullier type ewes will end up eating an awful lot more. And the weaker, timid ewes will be bullied out of the troughs, and they'll, instead of getting 600 or 700 grams a day, they'll end up getting 200 grams a day. And the ewe that's supposed to be getting 600 or 700 grams a day and is a bully might end up getting 1.2 kilos, and she's the one that might end up with acidosis. And also to watch there very much is the ewes that are lame. So lameness in late pregnancy is something that we really need to combat. Go in there with usually it's either foot rot or CODD, hopefully not CODD, but in most cases it's probably foot rot. Go in with an antibiotic based on your veterinary diagnosis and prescription, and treat that so that the sheep are able to get to the trough and hold their ground at the trough and get their fair share. So they're really the important things, Ciarán. Introduce it gradually and increase it gradually over time. Adequate truck space, so at least for most people that's 500 to 600 millimeters per ewe of truck space. That's more space now than the ewes will take up along your truck. Feeding twice per day, at least 8 hours apart every day, once you go over 500 grams a day. And lastly, Ciarán, the one is not to change the ration or the concentrate you're feeding in the last kind of 3 or 4 weeks when you're up at that high level. Don't switch. And even when you're getting a new batch in from the miller, mix some of the old batch, the remaining old batch with the new batch, just in case that there's an ingredient change there, to avoid, a change in ingredients and a dietary upset arising from that.
Look, you raised a valid point again that we've often mentioned before. Some of them riskier animals, the lame ones, that ideally, if in an ideal world, we'd have a separate scenario or a separate pen to hold them in. Just something else, Michael, like another practical aspect of that feed level that's gone in, and you actually covered this slightly, but the difference in density in some of the rations, they will weigh different. Knowing the number in the pen, actually having a weight of what the bucket or drum or bag, whatever it is you're dispensing with is, and adjusting that, especially as we move through pregnancy where ewes might be lambing and numbers are dropping off in the pens, it's another potential glitch in that feeding plan.
Yeah, it's very important that we know what's in the container, and it's actually amazing how many people will feed with a container, and they're not sure exactly how much it is. So I would find, if you look at the kind of the density of a nut is probably somewhere around 850, 900 grams per litre. And the density of coarse ration is probably somewhere around 700 grams per litre volume. So it's very simple to do this. You have a drum or a bucket of various different sizes. You fill it 3 or 4 times and weigh it with a stiller scale, or put the full bucket up on your lamb weighing scales. Do it a number of times and guesstimate. You'll get a good average as to what's inside in it. Is it 6 kilos? Is it 8 kilos? Is it 10, 12 kilos, depending on the size of the bucket or the drum. And then you'll know that half a bucket is half that amount. And really having a plan as to saying, okay, I'm 6 weeks out from lambing. I'm going to start at 200 grams a day or 300 grams a day, and I'm going to go to 500 grams a day, in 2 weeks' time, and then I'm going to 700 grams a day for the last 2 weeks, and then working out how many buckets you need for the number of sheep in the pen. And as sheep are lambing and you're pulling sheep, ewes and lambs out of the pen, that you adjust your the amount you're putting into the bucket accordingly. And that's just that.
It might seem overly simplistic, but in reality, that's how it's put into action. Like, look, we mentioned density. Let's get to the nuts and bolts. Your ration quality, and it is important at this stage here we use a quality ration. If we look at first, maybe, Michael, the energy density in rations, like, what are we looking for? Like in a bag, when we pick it up, if we look at the label on it or the spec we get from the supplier, where are we looking for the high energy ingredients in that?
Yeah, so okay, I suppose we don't get an energy density on the label, or it's not required anyway for the miller to put that on. Really, what's required for the miller is to put on the ingredients in either descending or alphabetical order. The miller needs to give us crude protein, crude fiber, crude oil, various other things like that, ash, mineral content, and look, at energy won't be on that. So in order to estimate how good or bad a ration is from an energy point of view, we need to look at the ingredients, and the ingredients will give us a good handle as to whether this is a highly energy dense ration or whether it's more of a filler type. It has a lot of filler type ingredients in there. So generally, look at what we do is we divide the ingredients that are in rations into 3 kind of categories. So we use a traffic light system. Lots of people will have seen it on Teagasc publications in the past, where we have green, orange, or amber, and red. And green are the really high energy dense ones. The orange or amber ones are the middle of the road, and then the red ones are the low energy. And it's purely on an energy density basis that we're doing that. So we're saying, that your cereals and your pulps, things like distillers and soybean meal, they're very high in energy. They're in the green category. They're your most dense. And look, there's variations between them. If you look, oats is probably much lower in energy than, say, wheat or maize. But as a general rule, we can say, look at cereals, distillers, soybean meal, your pulps, your citrus pulp and your beet pulp, high in energy. So middle of the road, then in the amber category, we have our things like soya hulls, a little bit lower in energy than the other one. So that's why it's in there. It's quite a good feed, but just that little bit lower in energy. Gluten is in there, and rapeseed would be in there as well. So they're just about 10-12% lower in energy than what's kind of in the green category. And then in the red category, these are the kind of the lower, a lot of them very high in fiber, but low in energy type ingredients. So in that we've got our things like wheat feed, pollard, sunflower, palm kernel, various different ones like that, oat feed. So these are things that are in rations, and we regularly see them in rations, but they're just that good bit lower in energy, and we just need to be conscious of that. So when you're looking at the ration, there's two things you need to look at. Is one, the ingredients that are in it. So what we'll call that the quality of the ration. And the second one is the price. And you need to bear the two of them in mind, because we could have a lower spec ration, but it's very, very good value. So we just feed a little bit more of it to get the same amount of energy into the ewes, as opposed to having a real Rolls Royce ration with all super duper ingredients in it, but it's a very, very expensive ration. So despite the fact that you're feeding less of it, it's costing an awful lot more per ewe to feed that very expensive ration or high spec ration. So people need to be conscious of that okay, you can buy a ration that is 10% lower in energy, which means to get the same amount of energy into the sheep, you need to feed 10% more. But it might be 20% cheaper. So you're still better off to buy the lower spec ration, because it's a specification by price interaction that you need to look at. But generally what we would be saying is try to go for something that has quite a few high quality ingredients from a density point of view, energy density point of view, some middle of the road ones, and maybe one or two low quality ones. Fine, a lot of millers put them in there because they increase the fiber level, which is also very important. And also, some millers have said to me that putting wheat feed in just helps it go through the mill. It's almost like a lubricant going through the mill. No problem with that, as long as there's an awful lot of it in the ration. So that's where the amount that's in the ration comes into play, and you'll see that in the descending order of inclusion. So most millers will give the ingredients in descending order of inclusion. So the one that's first in the list is the highest ingredient in terms of its inclusion level, and the one that's furthest down is the lowest. Now, generally, it's the minerals and those kind of additives that you see at the bottom, and the first 5 or 6 ingredients are probably what makes up most of the ration. That's important from an energy point of view, that we look at that.
We might come to the minerals in a minute, but indeed at that, I see some of them are starting to include the energy content in rations. Look, you mentioned energy, we mentioned a wee bit on fibre. The real other important one, particularly in the latter stage of pregnancy, the protein content and the spec of that protein, Michael. How important are the ingredients from a protein point of view? Or maybe are they more important?
Yeah, and I suppose that goes back to my list again. And if we look at the ones that are high up on the energy side of things, they generally tend to be the kind of better quality ones. You look at the Rolls Royce ingredient that we have from a protein point of view is soybean meal, and that's a really good quality protein. And it's also a significant amount of that protein is what we call rumen bypass protein. It's protein that isn't digested by the bugs in the rumen. It passes through the rumen undigested and is digested by the sheep herself in her intestine in the same way as monogastrics like ourselves would digest protein. And that has benefits from a colostrum and milk yield point of view, production point of view. So what we would say is look at you can buy a very high protein ration, but with very poor quality proteins in it, and it mightn't be as good as buying a lower protein ration with high quality protein ingredients.
Michael, some will opt to go maybe for 2 different rations, maybe only change it up again very close to lamb. And I know you highlighted some of the risks with that, but given the amount being fed, is that a sensible approach in that earlier stage of pregnancy?
Yeah. Look at it. I think early on, I suppose, when we were starting to feed meal, the amount of protein, most rations are going to be 16, 18, 19% protein, and I suppose when you're 6-8 weeks out from lambing, the protein that's there will be fine. The issue, I suppose, is as we come closer to lambing, we need a lot more protein. So our requirement goes from kind of maybe 110 grams of protein per head per day for a ewe with twins, up to kind of 240 grams per head per day. So we have a more than doubling requirement for protein as we go through the late stages of pregnancy. And the other thing, I suppose, here is that at that stage, especially in late pregnancy, the last 2 weeks before lambing, the quality of the protein becomes very important. So we'll have loads of protein that will be available in the rumen to the bugs, and they'll break that down. And basically what happens is the sheep ends up digesting the microbacteria protein as opposed to the protein that you're feeding the sheep. What we want at that stage really is a protein that's going to bypass that the bugs can't break down and that the sheep is going to digest in her own intestine. And that's really things like soybean meal, gluten to some extent, and distillers are probably reasonable. Okay, if we can get things like protected rapeseed, not that much available in Ireland, but protected proteins also bypass the rumen. But for most people, what we're talking about is soybean meal, and putting in about 100 grams of soybean meal there per lamb carried for the last 2 weeks. So for your twin ewes, it's 200 grams of soybean meal. If that's in the ration, if you have got a ration made up with 20% soybean and you're feeding a kilo a day, that'll give you your 200 grams of soybean meal. If you have a concentrate feed that has very little soya in it, maybe only 5% or 6%, which is what a lot of the commercially available rations out there will have, then it's a case of do you change rations at that late stage? And I would recommend no, that we don't change rations, because there's a big risk there of upsetting the sheep and running into big problems with acidosis and twin lamb disease and all those kind of things afterwards. So what we would say is, continue on with the existing ration, but maybe top it up with a bit of soybean meal, just to get up to that 100 grams of soybean meal per lamb carried in late pregnancy. And I think that's probably the best solution. People can feed the lower quality proteins up to that point, and then come in with a bit of soybean meal in late pregnancy where it's not in the ration already.
So, Michael, maybe finally, and it's one of the last things you see on the product label is the vitamins and minerals. Most, I assume, it's a standard preem mix that goes into them. Occasionally, you might see the inclusion of CalMag in it. Why is that important? And obviously, including minerals in the rationing for those home mixing is important. But the addition of CalMag, you might explain where its role comes in.
Yeah, look, I think I just want to say on this one, Ciarán, it's important that we go in with an appropriate vitamin mineral mix for a ewe vitamin and mineral mix, and that the ration is balanced. Whether that's somebody who is buying a ration or somebody who is home mixing and has a license to include a mineral, that they get an appropriate mineral, and really the mineral mix should be balanced according to the ingredients. So if we've got lots of cereal in there and very little pulp, then we're going to need additional calcium going in to get your calcium phosphorus ratio right. And conversely, if we have very little cereals and lots of pulp, pulps in there, we need to put in extra phosphorus to get those right. And then there's all the other micronutrients that are minerals that we need there, your vitamins E's and A's and B's and all those. So people need to have them right in the ration, and I think they're important and not very expensive. The other one you mentioned then was CalMag, and CalMag is basically calcined magnesite, which is basically a form of magnesium. that is available, and that's quite important in a ration, because it does two things. First of all, it really, why it's in there is to protect ewes against grass tetany after lambing, and that's probably the main source. But it's also quite useful in terms of the magnesium plays an important role in allowing or enabling the ewe to break down calcium in her body from her bones and prevent milk fever. So I think it's a useful mineral to have in every pre-lambing ewe ration. I'd be saying there should be a bit of CalMag in there. It just makes things better at lambing time. Doesn't cost an awful lot of money, and really should be included as a matter of course.
Michael, always good getting you on. So Liz, thanks very much for your insights.
All right, no bother. Thanks, Ciarán.
Okay, we'll finish things up at this point. Again, plenty of points to consider there from Michael. Getting that feeding regime right during late pregnancy, it does set a flock up for a good lambing. It sets them up for performance the rest of the year, particularly during early lactation. So it's important we get some of the key criteria right. Getting your ration quality right, feeding it right, determining how much we need to feed, managing condition score. All these things are important, and I think you covered a lot of aspects of it. That's it for me for this episode. Again, from any updates for the sheep program, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Ciarán Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and listen in to any of our episodes.